If I haven't had the opportunity of meeting you, my name is Raissa Kubandi. I am the student pastor here, so I hang out with 5th through 12th graders and then the amazing adult leaders that help serve alongside me in helping us serve these amazing group of people. And so we have been in the series as a church about love, right? And I have learned about love from a few different places. One of the main places I learned about love was from Disney. Okay, The Lion King taught me that, if you forget who you are, you forget your parents. Like, it's a big thing, right? And then puppy love or cub love, I don't know how you want to go with that, can turn into the real thing in adulthood, right? Like, Simba was out here, Hakuna Matata, vibing with his homies, and then Nala shows up and he's like, I want to be a king again. I want to be with her, so I'll become a king again, right? The 80s taught me that a boombox outside of a window can fix anything. Okay, if you're standing outside of a window with a boombox in your hands, it's the real thing, right? And then 90s R&B taught me a lot about love. There's some things I can't share from the stage, but there are things I can share. And one of the things I learned is that if you and your boys are not standing outside of a window in the rain wearing a choreographed outfit with a perfect dance routine, you really don't love her. Okay, you're really not that committed to the young lady that you say you are committed to. Would it help if you weren't in these streets? Yes, but the dancing will help fix the problems you create. As a child, I watched my parents love each other. And one of the things that they taught me about love is that sometimes you just call someone in the middle of the workday because you miss the sound of their voice. There were times where I'd be driving with my mom somewhere, and so she wouldn't pick up her phone, and my dad would call my cell phone and say, hey, can I talk to my wife? My brother taught me that love is learning how to listen and also learning how to lose well. I've never beat him in a basketball game, and I'm not angry about that. I just want to say that out loud. And my baby sister taught me that love looks like being honest about an outfit, especially if there is time to change. There's time. Those blues don't go together, and it's not okay. So by the time I have come to a place to hear that God is love, I've had a million different experiences explaining, seeing, and feeling love. So what does love look like done God's way? If you are someone that has been to a lot of Christian weddings, you have had the opportunity to hear 1 Corinthians 13 read. And so we'll read that together as our primary text, and then we will talk a little bit about love done God's way. All right, it says this. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no records of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. And so this morning, instead of looking at all of those definitions of love, we're going to primarily focus on the reality that love is patient. In the original language, this word love is a compound Greek word, right? I'm not going to pretend that I can pronounce it, so you're just going to look at it from over there. And it says it's the ability to exhibit internal and external control in difficult circumstances. In English, it would be called long-suffering. It is a patient holding out under trial, a long, protracted restraint of the soul from yielding to passion, especially the passion of anger. Love is long-suffering. So there are three things that this compound Greek word teaches us about love. The first thing that it teaches us about love is that love has a pace. There is a pace at which love operates that is reflected in the way that God operates in the world. We look at the creation poem, and there, in an instant, God could have created everything. He could have made beauty out of chaos. He could have put the plants and the animals and done all of that in an instant. But instead, in Genesis 1, we see him hover over the waters, over this chaotic nothing. And then we see him create light from darkness. And then we see him stop the waters. And we see him plant plants. And we see him put fish in the sea. And we see him put birds in the air. And so love could have operated quickly, but it operated patiently. It operated slowly. What he could have done in an instant, he did over 7 movements. Love has a pace. We see it again when he is creating a nation, and he could have chosen the most powerful nation of that time, but instead he finds a man named Abraham, and he says, hey, your seed will bless the entire earth, but his wife was barren, and so he causes this one man to have a son, and that son has 2 sons, and then one of those 2 sons has 12, and then over time, that group of people becomes a tribe, and that tribe eventually needs to flee economic struggle, and so they go into Egypt, and that group of people become shepherds, and they become people that care for the flock of Egypt. But as pharaohs rose that saw them as a problem instead of a solution, those people became oppressed, then they became slaves, and then eventually they cried out for their freedom. And all the while, love is forming a nation in the background. And then what love decides to do is, instead of showing up with thousands of angels to free his people, he sends a man named Moses to grow up in the house of Pharaoh, eventually to go into the wilderness for 40 years and come back and set his people free. Love has a pace, and it moves slowly and deliberately and diligently. And then again, we see when love sends the rescuer of the world. He could have sent a king. He could have sent a warrior. He could have sent all of angels' armies, but instead he sends a baby born in a manger. Love operates slowly and patiently. Love has a pace. The second thing that we see in this word is that love has an intensity. The kind of suffering that it talks about here is an intense suffering. And so here is the thing that this suffering does not invite us into. It does not invite us into abuse or mistreatment, but it invites us to recognize that when you love, you will hurt. At one point or another, you're going to have to forgive someone. You're going to have to apologize. You're going to have to be vulnerable. You're going to have to work through your pain. This suffering is not an invitation for abuse or mistreatment, but is a recognition that when you love, you'll hurt. And we see it most clearly when we see a child brought into the world. Every year on November 20th, my friends gather around and they provide me with cheesecake and wine. They give me awesome gifts and they celebrate me. We do karaoke. Next year we're doing laser tag. It's gonna be bananas. Okay, I'm the most competitive person I know, but I'm surrounded by people that are better at me than everything, and it's God's way of keeping me humble. I think it's his mercy towards me. And every year, I get phone calls, text messages, FaceTimes, I get gifts. But I think for all intensive purposes, we're celebrating the wrong person. The person we should be celebrating is the woman that carried me for 9 months. And at the end of that 9-month period, her reward was pushing out this Central African forehead. And I know what it is. I look at it every morning. I'm just like, look at you. You just look so good. And if you were to ask this woman, would you do it again? Would you deal with the hormones? Would you do the natural childbirth? God bless her. Would you do it again? She would say yes. Because when you love, the suffering does not overwhelm the joy of being able to love someone well. So love has a pace. Love has an intensity. And lastly, love is resilient. This is how Google defines resilience. It is the ability to recoil and spring back into shape after bending, stretching, or being compressed. Long-suffering love does not deform the lover, but instead it transforms the one who is loved. Long-suffering does not deform the lover, but instead it transforms the one being loved. One of my favorite people in the entire Bible is a dude named Peter. Peter was a fisherman who grew up in a small town. And when this teacher started to grow in fame, this teacher named Jesus, he said, hey, Peter, come follow me. And Peter was like, yo, I'm not worthy. And Jesus said, don't worry, I'm going to make you a fisher of men. I'm going to help you become the thing that you were made to be. And the great thing about Peter is Peter's like me. He's like, once he's in, he is all in. Right? Like Peter was that dude. Like, you know how like you have that one friend where you hope that nothing goes wrong because they will stab somebody? Right? Like you're just like, yo, like I'm not even that offended about what happened, but they're like, no, they disrespected you. It's the end of their lives. And I'm like, yo, calm down. You know? Like my little sister is that friend. She's like, what is his name? And then she'll give me a dossier. Okay, he went to kindergarten here. This is where he went to high school. These are all 5 of his exes. I'm like, man, it was one date. We're okay, right? Like she is that friend, right? And then so Peter, once he was in, he was all in. One time Jesus was telling his disciples like, yo, I'm gonna have to die for y'all. And Peter pulls Jesus aside and says, hey, I know you have plans, but I have plans too, okay? You're not gonna die. Right? Like he is telling Jesus how this is going to go down. And then eventually there comes the night where Jesus sitting with his disciples at the Passover feast and they're having a conversation and he tells his disciples, yo, one of you will betray me. And when this betrayal happens, all of you will scatter. And Peter's like, everyone can scatter, but I will die for you. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, I have prayed for you. They have asked for your soul, but I have prayed for you. But I'm letting you know, bud, that before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny me 3 times. A few hours later, Jesus praying in the garden with a group of his friends. This was the place that he always went to go pray. And so there he is praying. He is overwhelmed. Scripture tells us that he is beginning to sweat blood because he understands what's about to happen. His disciples, including Peter, have fallen asleep during this prayer time because they're so emotionally exhausted from the events of the day. In the distance, we hear the sound of soldiers approaching. And leading those soldiers is one of Jesus' friends, a man named Judas. Judas approaches Jesus, and Jesus looks at Judas and says, Judas, you betray me with a kiss. One of the soldiers asks, who is Jesus of Nazareth? Jesus says, I am him. Peter sees what's about to happen. And so he pulls out his sword. And in this moment, he is proving with passion and decision that I am willing to die for you. And he cuts off the ears of one of the soldiers. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, dude, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword, and heals the soldier's ear. And then Jesus gets carried away, gets taken away to be dealt with, to go on trial by the religious leaders at the time. The Bible tells us that Peter is following Jesus at a distance as he is watching him being taken away by these soldiers. And he ends up at the house of the high priest, the religious leader of the Jewish people at the time. And Jesus is in a room where people one at a time begin to accuse him of things he had never said or had never done. And Peter is sitting in the courtyard watching this happen. And as he's sitting in this courtyard, a young servant girl walks up to Peter and says, aren't you with him? And Peter denies it. Again, in this room, we have Jesus being hit and spat on and accused and mocked. And then we have Peter standing by the courtyard, and someone else says, no, you are Galilean, you are with him. And Peter says, no, I do not know this man. And again, we see Jesus in this room, in this courtyard, as people are throwing all of these accusations at him. They begin to say things like, if you are the Son of God, tell us who struck you. And for a third time, someone says, you have to be one of his disciples. And Peter again says, I do not know what you are talking about. And then he begins to call down curses on himself. And in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that in the moment where Peter denies Jesus for a third time, that they make eye contact, and Peter goes away weeping. Passion didn't keep Peter committed. Passion wasn't enough. Then we see Jesus get crucified. We see him raised from the dead. We see him tell these two women that were at his tomb, go and tell my brothers and Peter that I'm back. Fast forward, we see Jesus and Peter having this conversation, and Jesus says, Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter responds and says, Lord, you know I love you more than these. And then Jesus says, take care of my sheep. Again, Jesus asks, Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter says, Lord, you know I love you. And then Jesus again asks him to take care of the sheep. And the Gospel of John tells us a third time, Jesus asks, Peter, do you love me more than these? And John puts this little note in the passage. He says, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked for a third time, do you love me? And though Peter was hurt, he didn't know he was being restored, because he denied him 3 times, and now he proclaimed him 3 times. And that's not where the story ends. Church history tells us that Peter started the church. He preached the message, and thousands of people came to know the Lord. Eventually, the Roman government arrests Peter. And in their cruelty, they arrest Peter and his wife. And they crucify her first in front of him, as if that would be enough to make this man deny Jesus. And it should have been, because the first time when he watched his Savior be arrested, he denied him because of a question. And this time, he stands and watches his wife be crucified, and he doesn't deny the Lord. Then this insane thing happens when it's his turn. He looks at these soldiers and says, I am not worthy to die in the same manner of my Lord. And he asks to be crucified upside down. What kind of love is this that turns a coward into a courageous man? What kind of love is this that even in the midst of your greatest pain, he cannot deny the goodness and the reality and the faithfulness of the God that he has served, of the King that he has decided to follow? What kind of love is this? This is the kind of long-suffering, transformative love that God invites us into. But not only does he invite us to receive it, he invites us to model it. In John 13:4, we're going to land this plane. Jesus is talking to his disciples at that dinner. This is before his crucifixion. And he says, a new command I give to you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. This love that has a pace, this love that has an intensity, this love that has a resilience, Not only are we called to receive it, but we are called to give it. And you may be asking yourself, Raissa, how do I learn to love like this? Because there are limitations to my love. There are limitations to my kindness. There are limitations to my ability to sacrifice well. Raissa, how do I learn to love like this? We learn to love like this by positioning ourselves to receive this love. And how do we position ourselves to receive this love? We receive it in vulnerability and in reality. Man, there's so many things I wish I was. I wish I was a little bit taller. I wish I was a baller. Just kidding. I am. A baller, not taller. There's so many things I project that I am. But real love, transformative love, can only be received by who I really am. In my weaknesses, in my strengths, in my failures, in my insecurities. This transformative love can only happen in the reality that I am living in and in vulnerability. So it's not only just being like, yo, this is who I am, but to admit that to Jesus and for him to come in and be like, yeah, I see that. And I love that. I see that, and I love that. I see that, and I love that. And over again, as he declares that over me, my soul is transformed. My heart is healed because God cannot love who I pretend to be. He can only love me. So we live out John 13 if we're willing to receive the love that he wants to give us in our reality. So you're asking yourself, right, so how do I do this? In vulnerability and in reality. And in the words of the Apostle John, real love is this, not that I love him, but that he loved me. And that he gave himself as a sacrifice for me, as a proportionate. He took my place, he took my scars, he took my story, and he said, I love it, and I will die for it, and I will heal it, and I will transform it. And this is the God that we serve. This is the God that we serve. So this morning, we're going to participate in two practices that the church has been doing for thousands of years that gives us a physical representation of accepting and receiving this love. We're going to light an Advent candle, and we're going to participate in communion together. So before we do that, let's just take like 30 seconds to pause and to pray. And this is not on the script, so we'll just do it. If there's anybody in this room that has never received this kind of love, that has never received the love of Jesus in a way that is healing some of the pain and brokenness in your heart, that introduces you to new life. If you're in this room and you want to accept Jesus for the first time, or for the 1,000th time, would you mind just raising your hand so I know who I'm praying for? See those hands? Holy Spirit, thank you for every hand that was raised. And we ask that you would meet these individuals. When the angels declared your arrival, they called you Emmanuel. They called you God with us. So I pray for every person that raised their hands, that they would know that they are receiving God with them in every way and in every shape. We love you, Lord.